Chapter 4. Gideon is set apart. From Judges chapter 6, verse 25 through 32. It was that very same evening of this monumental day in Gideon's life that the word of Yahuah came to him regarding his next move. Yahuah had found himself a man who was utterly available to his purposes, obedient to his will. He had found a man daring enough to comply with his commands. In that man and through him, he would accomplish astonishing exploits in Yasharel. It is ever so with Yahuah. His eyes run to and fro across all the earth, eternally on the lookout for anyone who is open and sensitive to his merciful spirit, who will cooperate with his wishes and thus become identified with his purposes on the earth. Sometimes the intentions of Yahuah for his people can be extremely upsetting and deeply disturbing. They are like a mighty earthquake, shaking and unsettling all the tired old traditions and deadening habits of our lives and homes. It simply must be so if there is to be a new direction and drive to our endeavors. Yahuah simply does not pour the new wine of his life into the cracked and leaking old wineskins of our dry little lives. He does not stitch the fresh new cloak of his own character to the tattered, weakened cloth of our old characters. There must be a total renewal that begins at the central core of the inner citadel of our makeup. Eventually, it extends to take in the entirety of our beings, so that the net result is a total transformation of the person, as it has been put so powerfully by Shaul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. Therefore, if any man be in Yahushua the Messiah, he is a new creature. The old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new, and all things are of Yahuah. With Gideon, this titanic transformation was to begin with the false Elohims of his family, Baal and Asheroth. They simply had to go. There could no longer be any sort of cozy, accommodating compromise with these pagan effigies. They had to be torn from their place of prominence among his people. Yahuah's first command from fire-filled Mount Sinai to his servant Moshe had been, "You will have no other mighty ones before me." And that edict still stood unchanged. This very night, Gideon would tear down the great family altar to Baal, erected by his father's household. He would, true to his own name, the cutter down, chop down the sacred grove and idol totem pole planted in honor of Ashtaroth. All that stood for subservience to these Elohim of affluence, sex, violence, and licentiousness would have to be supplanted by an altar to Yahuah, the living and true Elohim of Yasharel. This was no simple thing to do, to fly in the face of his family's sacred rites, to risk the rage of his father's fury, to challenge the customs of his entire community with utter impunity was to invite dreadful consequences. It could very well mean incurring not only the displeasure and angry hostility of his own home and family, but also cruel censure from the whole community. In fact, it could very well cost him his life. The cost of following Yahuah is always high. The challenge to become one of his loyal ones is ever lofty. The high road of set-apartness, wholesome living, to which he calls men, is not strewn with rose petals. It is a tough trail, rocky and rugged, with the stern stones of heavenly demands. Yahushua made this very clear when he was among us. He insisted that Yahuah's claim upon his chosen men of valor supersede any made upon them by their family or friends. He simply insisted upon first place in their affection. For to have met and found Yahuah was to have encountered the explosive force of a newfound affection in life. This is precisely what had happened to Gideon under the dusty old oak that day. So this very night, with calm composure and irrepressible intent, he set out to demolish the last vestige of the spurious counterfeit Elohims. The last shred of devotion to any strange deity would be torn from the citadel of his affections and that of his family. Courage, calm, cool, calculating, courage carries with it an enormous contagion. It is its own best advertisement, and apparently this young countryman had no difficulty at all enlisting the help of 10 others to carry out his daring adventure in the dark. Even though the 10 men were his father's servants, they too, under Gideon's gallant leadership, readily threw in their lot with the bold young man. They quickly yoked up their master's bull with a second one, 7 years of age. These bulls, like the kid Gideon had sacrificed that day, must have been kept hidden in some secret enclosure or cave. At least, up to this point, they had escaped the prying eyes of the rapacious Midianites. Perhaps, as is often done in very hot countries, they had often been teamed up at night to do the plowing under moonlight when heat and flies were absent. Then the work went much easier for both owner and beast. In any case, Gideon and his 10 accomplices led the powerful team down to the giant altar of Baal under cover of darkness. What had to be done swiftly and surely. An air of intense excitement gripped the gang. They were bent on a dangerous mission. It could mean their lives, but there was no turning back or to the side. The Elohim of Gideon, the Elohim of Yasharel, the Elohim who brought fire from the rock to consume the sacrifice was among them. His presence was there. His person was real. His power was evident and apparent to his people. What he said, they would do without question or debate. The straining team was hitched to strong ropes secured around the great stone monolith. At first, it refused to budge, but as the drivers shouted to their beast and lashed them with their whips, mighty muscles swelled and tendons strained until finally the great stone structure began to totter. With a resounding rumble, it tumbled to the earth in a cloud of dust and debris. Under Gideon's guidance, the very last vestiges of the pagan altar were razed to the ground. Not a single chip of stone remained standing upon another. In its place, Gideon carefully instructed his companions to collect 12 large, similar-sized, rough, uncut boulders from his father's rocky fields. These he ordered to be laid up carefully in 3 tiers of 4 stones each. This altar stood strong as a symbol of communion between the 12 tribes of Yasharel and their Yahuah. Always, this had been the traditional form taken by his people in direct compliance with the command of Yahuah. The altar was erected with great care upon the large smooth rock, upon which, earlier in the day, he had offered his personal sacrifice to his Melech visitor. That was its foundation. So, when the work was done, the structure stood strong and sturdy beneath the stars. It had been a big job, not easy to carry out in the dark while all his friends and family slept soundly beneath their blankets. Very often, the greatest accomplishments for Yahuah are carried out in the quietness of our own inner lives. There, away from the view of our contemporaries, we carry out the private and personal commitments entrusted to us by Yahuah. While others around us may be sound asleep, we are on the go for Yahuah. It is not necessarily a case of indulging in personal daring. It is not a matter of brazen bravado. It is simply a question of doing what Yahuah asks us to do. Gideon then instructed his men to take their axes to the sacred grove and totem tree. It was an eerie sound to hear the sharp metal tools tearing and slicing into the tough wood. It was surprising that chopping did not awaken the village. When the timber crashed to the ground, Heavy thuds shook the earth. It was Gideon's first great hour of esteem. The false Elohim were down, torn from their positions of prominence. A grin of glee spread across his strong features. All had gone well. There remained only one last step. Then his assignment was complete. He ordered the felled wood to be chopped into fuel. The 7-year-old bullock that had survived 7 years of Midianite occupation would be butchered. A supreme sacrifice of its flesh would be made to Yahuah upon the newly built altar. This sacrifice of a bullock was the sacrifice of sin for a man's entire family and nation. The action was not lost on his men. They were well aware of its implications. This ritual, carried out under cover of darkness, was an atonement being made on behalf of the perverseness of their people. It was a sin offering for a nation that had rejected and repudiated Yahuah and their Redeemer. As the flames on the altar licked at the flesh and consumed the fat, its pungent aroma filled the night air. The commingled fragrance of wood, smoke, and roasting meat drifted into the night sky. It wafted here and there on the night breezes. For 7 long, tedious, torturous years, no such spectacle had been seen in Yasharel. By the light of the flickering fire on the altar, Gideon and his men saw to it that not a scrap of wood from the Ashtoreth remained. Every chip was burned, and not a shred of meat remained. The cleansing fire consumed all. As the day dawned with streaks of crimson light in the east, only a bed of ashes cooled on the newly erected altar. For Gideon, this had been his first giant step following Yahuah. It stood for his total set-apartness to the call of Yahuah. He was no longer just one of the crowd. He was a man set apart for special service. He was a leader, now singled out to save his people. He had cleared the decks of his life from any counterfeit complications. He had come clean with Yahuah. The idols in his life were torn away. He was a man ready for action, prepared and purified for combat. Nothing remained to drag him down or hobble his movements. He was free to follow Yahuah. He was free to fight great battles. He was free to face the enemy unafraid. He was free from divided affections or diluted loyalties. He was free to triumph. For Gideon, this was the dawning of a new day. He had never been this way before. Likewise, for his kinsmen and fellow villagers, it was the beginning of a new era in their experience. None of us can live as islands to ourselves. Invariably, our conduct and character make an enormous impact for right or evil upon our contemporaries. And Gideon's actions, like a pebble dropped into the quiet waters of their stagnant lives, would send waves of repercussions to the very extremity of their little world. "Who has done this dastardly thing?" the villagers shouted angrily when they saw what had happened in the night. "Who has torn down the altar to Baal, raised the Ashtaroth, and erected a new altar in its place?" Their eyes flamed, and their voices were raised in a high, screaming crescendo of vituperation. "Whoever the iconoclast is, he must die," they yelled vehemently. "No one dare to do this dreadful deed without paying the supreme penalty. Gideon must die! Gideon must die!" they shouted in unison. It was a cry to be echoed 800 years later outside of Pilate's Hall in Jerusalem. It is ever the cry of a people who will neither recognize nor receive the true and living Yahuah. The gray-haired Yoash, venerated old gentleman that he was in the community and clan of the Abizarites, was challenged to deliver his son, Gideon. The young man must die. He could not be allowed to upset the status quo of their staid little society. But Yoash, too, had been touched with the transforming dynamic of the new life in his son. To put it into our modern parlance, he had long yearned for a renewal of the old-time religion. His heart hankered for a word from heaven. He had ached deep inside for a manifestation of the power and presence of Yahuah. It had seemed so long, too long in truth, since Yahuah had laid bare his great arm to save his people from their peril. What Gideon had done quickened his father's faith. It stirred his slumbering spirit. It startled his sleepy soul. With enormous audacity and courage, he challenged the attackers. If Baal, your Elohim, be a true Elohim, let him defend himself. If he is authentic, let him protect himself. It was a startling counterattack. His antagonists were thrown into disarray. It was one thing for young Gideon to undertake great exploits for Yahuah. It was quite another for his venerable father to endorse what he did with such virile vehemence. Yahliness polarizes people. As the might and power and presence of Yahuah's spirit, Ruach, became manifest in this man, those around him were immediately divided. Some would be loyal, others not. Out of enormous respect and admiration, Joash nicknamed his son Yerubbaal, meaning the one who has beaten Baal. It was a term of high esteem and deep affection, wielding father and son in Gideon's first great escapade for Yahuah. Chapter 5, Gideon's Call to Arms. From Judges, chapter 6, verse 33 through 40. It was just at this crucial juncture in the personal life of Gideon that a massive movement of enemy forces got underway. Not only did the Midianites decide to overrun Yasharel again, but they brought with them allies from among the Amalekites and Desert Bedouin. A gigantic alliance of hostile forces assembled east of the Jordan. For some of these desert nomads, warring, raiding, and plundering were and ever have been a way of life. Even to this very day, the Arab Bedouin remain a roving remnant of fierce fighters. Their main preoccupation is the plundering and pillaging of strangers who stray into their territory or neighboring nations. Hawks of the wild waste, they stoop to the kill with cruel frenzy. And now, the combined forces of these foes, with their warriors mounted on camels, crossed the fords of the Jordan. Like a huge, moving, sinister swarm of devouring locusts, they swarmed up the valley of Yezreel. This was to penetrate the very heartland of Yasharel. This rich and fertile valley ran west like a giant corridor to the shining waters of the Mediterranean. It was the great open central invasion route that would enable an invader to cut Yasharel in half, dividing her forces. It is the same valley in which, ultimately, the great battle of Armageddon will be fought. After 7 years of occupation and oppression, Yasharel's plight appeared hopeless and precarious. It seemed inevitable that she would be wiped out as a people. Surely this would have been the case, but for the active intervention of the Ruach of the living Yahuah. Eternally alert, ever active, he was awake to the peril of Yahuah's chosen people, and in this hour of crisis came upon Gideon. To us moderns, who are conditioned to success being measured in size, scale, and superiority of numbers, it is difficult to grasp Yahuah's ways. His economy is, to put it rather bluntly, very baffling to human beings. He does not depend upon the masses or overwhelming forces to achieve his ends. Rather, he looks for a man here or a woman there, through whom his purposes are accomplished. It has ever been his way. Under the impulse of Yahuah's own spirit, the Ruach, Gideon quite literally became a man clothed in the person of Yahuah. But even more, As one of the very moving older translation puts it, the Ruach of Yahuah clothed himself with Gideon. Put in plain language, we would say that Gideon was both surrounded and permeated by the heavenly presence of Yahuah. He was in Yahuah, and Yahuah was in him. Or as our Messiah stated it so simply, I in you, and you in me. Here at last, Yahuah had found a man in whom he could move mightily. He had invaded a life through which his purposes could be realized with resounding success. Yahuah does not need or want our human skills, expertise, or resources. He wants us, our wills, our loyalty, our love, our implicit cooperation and obedience. Under the direction and inspiration of Yahuah's guidance, Gideon, the plain, unpretentious countryman, blew a trumpet. It was the ancient battle call to arms. This was something generals and military commanders did, not simple farm folk. Yet its effect was electrifying. Like chain lightning flashing across a black and stormy sky, the war cry coming from Gideon blazed across the country. It galvanized Yasharel into action. Such a bugle blast had not been heard for 7 long, dreary, dusty years. The battle cry had been a note muted and missing. The call to arms was a shout that stirred the blood. Beginning with his own little clan of Abiezar, men dropped their sickles and shears to pick up swords and spears. Gideon suddenly found himself the central catalyst around which enormous activity was precipitated. Men armed to the teeth gravitated to him from all around. Even those who the day before were determined to take his life for throwing down the altar to Baal turned about full face now to lend him their allegiance. It was an unbelievable spectacle. No such drama had stirred Yasharel for a generation. Footrunners sped away to the far corners of his own tribe, Manasseh, calling his compatriots into action. Other messengers raced breathlessly into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, summoning men to arms. Strange as it seems, there was an immediate response. Some 32,000 would-be warriors left their fields, their farms, their families, and their flocks to heed the rallying cry of their obscure countryman, a man whom most of them had never heard of before. In all the war annals of Yasharel, this was perhaps the most remarkable call to arms ever witnessed. Perhaps from our perspective, it is well to pause here briefly and discover what the inspired principle is that was at work. For this was no ordinary conscription of men for combat. It was not a methodical, man-made recruitment of military personnel. It was rather the marshaling and mobilization of a nation under supernatural impulse. Thousands upon thousands of hard-headed, downtrodden, discouraged people do not ordinarily volunteer for combat under the inexperienced command of an unknown, untrained novice. The secret was the source of Gideon's inspiration. Like a swelling stream, which alone knows its secret springs into the hills, so Gideon knew Yahuah. It was from Yahuah alone that his strength and courage came. Yet that inspired life went flooding out to touch and transform uncounted other thousands through this ordinary man. He was but the channel through which Yahuah poured his life to inspire and lift an entire nation. It is when a man's life has its springs in Yahuah's Ruach that there flows from him barakot and inspiration to the ends of the earth. It may well touch, refresh, and revive a host of places or people, which up until then knew nothing of its source. It had been Gideon's intimate, first-hand contact with the living Yahuah in personal encounter that supplied the enormous momentum of the moment. Not only had Yahuah given him the courage to overturn the inertia of his times, but also to inject an aura of adventure into his contemporaries. It was the obvious call of Yahuah upon him and the rightness of the time that rallied Yasharel's disorganized ragtag forces to his side. He had suddenly been catapulted into the role of a popular revolutionary who would smash to pieces, then tear away the cruel yoke of their oppressors. Beyond this, Gideon had to have the guidance of Yahuah to put in place once more kingship of Yahuah. If he was to be a great man of valor, it meant more than merely casting off the tyranny of Midian. It also implied that the kingship of Yahuah had to be reestablished among his people. A revolutionary, to stand tall in history, must provide his nation with something superior to what he destroyed. It is not enough to just tear down and demolish. One must then go on to lay a new foundation. One must erect a new structure superior to its predecessor for the right of all. As Gideon looked into the faces of the voluntary forces gathering around him, he could see no great assurance of victory. Many of the men were but untaught, untrained youths who perhaps for the first time had picked up a sword or grasped their father's spear to do battle. The weapons were awkward and unwielding in their still, soft, and unsure grasp. Many of these fellows were, like himself, farm lads who had come to his call eagerly, but also very frightened. They had never been immersed in the bloodbath of war. Some looked more like lambs ready for slaughter than lions prepared to pounce upon their prey. Gideon knew all too well the divided and disunited condition of his country. Already, fierce rivalries and deep smoldering jealousy burned between the lesser tribes, like his own, and the more powerful ones of Ephraim and Judea. In fact, he had not even dared to call on them for help in this dangerous mission. He would have been scoffed at with derision. They were too proud, too haughty, too superior to submit themselves to an unknown leader like himself. No, if he was to join battle with the enemy, he would pretty well have to go it alone. He could not even rely on the priesthood of his people for spiritual support. The tribe of Lui was conspicuous for its obvious absence in any advances made against the forces of evil. The judges who preceded Gideon had been drawn from among the laity. Like himself, they were the common clay of the common people, out of which Yahuah had chosen to shape vessels of special and noble service to society. Gideon may have been a simple son of the soil, but he was no simpleton. He may have been a humble landsman, but he was no ignorant lout. He may have been a farm fellow with some failings, but he was no fool. He was an honest, genuine man at the heart of this great movement in Yasharel. He knew with deep and unshakable conviction that victory would depend not on Gideon, but on Yahuah. He was acutely aware that if Yasharel was to survive and flourish, her salvation must come from above. The presence and power of Yahuah had to be with his people if they were to prosper in this tremendous undertaking. It was for this reason, and only this, that Gideon that night put out his fleece upon the hot, parched ground. He needed proof positive that it would be Yahuah himself who was to save Yasharel from the enemy hordes now camped in the very heartland of this country. He had to be assured that Yahuah's presence would go with him as he led this motley mob of men into battle. Earlier that day, he had cast his eye across the broad, sweeping plain of Yezreel. What he saw there would have made any lesser man's courage turn to water. The black goat-skin tents of the Bedouin covered the ground like an ominous dark shadow. The amassed multitudes of Midianites spread across the landscape like a formidable swarm a vociferous locust consuming everything in sight. The ominous might of the enemy was enough to strike stark white terror into his own trembling heart. His help must come from Yahuah. His direction must be heavenly inspired. His leadership must come from Yahuah. At sundown, Gideon stretched his fleece of wool on the dust outside his home. He laid it significantly upon the very spot where he first stood amid the dust and chaff of a thrashing floor when the Melech of Yahuah came to him. He was going back to his own beginnings with Yahuah. He was returning to the very point at which Yahuah had promised to be with him. Gideon had identified himself with his fleece. It was his fleece, and in that fleece he saw himself stretched out before his Yahuah. He was waiting quietly for the heavenly dew of Yahuah's merciful Ruach to descend and rest upon him. This he expected. This he anticipated. This he must have. Just as Moshe of old had cried out to Yahuah, "I will not go forward and lead this nation unless your presence go with me." So now the same plea came from Gideon. Yahuah had declared often to Yasharel, "I will be as the dew unto Yasharel." And Gideon claimed that commitment for himself. Even though it was harvest time, even though it was hot and arid with summer sun, even though dew seldom lay on the ground these still mornings, Gideon came out at dawn to find his fleece soaking wet. It was more than merely damp. It was saturated. Yahuah's confirmation to the young man was, "Though all around you is a people dry spiritually and desiccated morally, my Ruach has descended, fills and saturates your soul. Assuredly, I am with you. I go with you. I send you. I lead you." In a gesture of commingled joy and courage, Gideon gathered up the fleece in his big brown fist. He wrung it out with a great twisting action of his sinewy arms. Jubilantly, he collected the water in his bowl, the same empty gravy bowl from which he had poured out his broth to Yahuah a few days before. Yahuah does not delay in filling what is emptied. He quickly replaces with his own free-flowing life any part of life that is vacated for his presence to possess. Gideon's gravy had been replaced with Yahuah's esteem. But that in itself was not enough. The following evening, he entreated Yahuah to allow him to reverse the ritual. Again, the fleece would be spread out on the dusty thrashing floor. Yahuah be pleased that though it should remain dry, all around would be wet with dew from heaven. And it was so. To Gideon, this was ample confirmation that even if he himself might later fail or become dry, Yahuah's barakot refreshment would in fact still fall upon and revive all of Yasharel around him. This, though they were dry as dust in their present spiritual state. Again, the proof was provided. Yahuah would be with Yasharel. All the ground was wet the next morning. In the strength of that assurance, Gideon went to war. His faith had been confirmed. His trust was in Yahuah. Chapter 6. Gideon prepares for battle. From Judges chapter 7, verse 1 through 8. Once Gideon had received positive confirmation from Yahuah, by way of the fleece, that the war with Midian was in Yahuah's plan, he lost no time preparing for combat. In fact, it was the alacrity and promptness with which Gideon obeyed Yahuah that accounted for his great victory over the enemy. Once his course of action was clear, he did not delay or drag his heels in carrying out his commission. It is terribly important to grasp this basic principle. Too often, even when we know what Yahuah's wishes are for us, we tend to vacillate in our decisions. We merely entertain the idea of doing that which has been requested of us. We toy with the commands of Yahuah. We turn them over and over in our minds, viewing them from every angle, as though they were playthings given to us purely for pleasure or self-indulgence. To do this is to play games with Yahuah. It is really an enormous affront to him. It represents colossal conceit on our part, and invariably the net result is that the purposes for our lives in the planned economy of Yahuah are thwarted and frustrated. It is only his favorites and marvelous patience with our petty perverseness that saves us from irrevocable disaster. Gideon had been given the go-ahead sign from Yahuah. He did not hold back from preparing for battle. There was a war to be won. There was a fierce contest to be fought. There was an opponent to be overcome. Sitting around and just talking about battle tactics would never do the job. His directives were coming from above. Yahuah was going with him. He would move into action. His confidence was in Yahuah. He would advance in faith no matter how overwhelming the enemy forces. So, at dawn the next day, he and his irregular army of 32,000 men made their first great camp at the well of Harod. It was situated across the great valley of Yezreel, opposite Moreh, where the Midianites were already encamped. It was possible in the clear morning light to look across the fertile plain and see the foe mustered on the far side in their massed hordes. It was a threatening sight, fearsome enough to make Gideon's untrained men tremble in their sandals. Even the name of the watering place, Harod, was in no way reassuring, for it meant the place of trembling. Already, some of the new recruits began to have second thoughts about being there. It was one thing to boast proudly about breaking off the enemy bonds while back home in their caves, dens, and underground dugouts, but it was a totally different thing to stand here on the edge of the open plain, imagining what it would be like to engage in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy cavalry mounted on camels. Even the best of Gideon's warriors had been unable to bring along a donkey, let alone such sophisticated war equipment as horses or chariots. No, indeed, the prospects were far from promising. In fact, they were downright frightening. Many of Gideon's men were quite sure they would be slaughtered on this plain by the overwhelmingly superior enemy forces. A mood of despair spread among them. Whispers of foreboding filtered through the ranks of massed men. The contagion of craven fear began to spread from one to another. Yahuah was not the least perturbed by this. He knew it would happen. Like most of us, these timid men could see only the terrible threat of their circumstances. Their whole attention was focused on the foe, not on the one who would lead them to triumph. "You have far too many troops," was the blunt, blood-chilling declaration of Gideon's inspired commander. It was an assessment of the situation that would have shattered the confidence in any lesser man. Too many troops! If it had not been such an appalling appraisal, it might have been laughable. But Gideon knew better by now than to dismiss Yahuah lightly or laugh at his declarations. "I will not permit Yasharel to overthrow Midian with such a mass of men. Inevitably, it would give them grounds for boasting about their own prowess in war. Send home the shaky-kneed soldiers." Gideon, his own heart a little aflutter, could quite easily have tossed in the towel at this point. It was one thing to go into battle with a reasonable array of military might. It was quite another to look like a fool taking on a formidable foe who had overwhelming odds in their favor. Again, Gideon did not debate the issue. He did not draw back in despair. He did not question his commands. He had been given clear, explicit orders. He would comply and carry them out no matter what the cost. Without flinching, he ensued immediate instructions to his men. Anyone who is the least bit fearful or afraid to face the foe is free to go home. It is doubtful indeed if ever in the entire history of war such an incredible order had been given by a commanding officer. This sort of thing just is not done. Always the opposite is true. No man is ever spared who might possibly lend increased might and power to the offensive. For Gideon, the next couple of hours must have been the epitome of agony. First, a few of the most faint-hearted picked up their weapons of war, and with a low murmur, turned their backs to their companions as they headed for home. Their action spurred others to follow suit, and soon a stream of the finest fighting men moved away en masse. In fact, 22,000 turned tail to return to their families and farms. In a single morning, Gideon had been stripped of nearly 2/3 of his armed forces. Any other general would have called it quits. All that were left to him was the equivalent of a single division of 10,000 untrained troops. If most of us had been placed in this man's uninevitable position, we would have been very sure that Yahuah had his wires all crossed up. But Yahuah's lines of communication were very clear. He knew what he was doing. Gideon did not doubt it. This in itself is a remarkable tribute to the man's unshakable confidence in Yahuah. He did not question what was happening. He simply proceeded step by step to do as he was told. This precisely was the secret to his ultimate success. It is only the person prepared and willing to comply promptly with the immediate wishes of Yahuah at the moment who can be sure of clear direction and light for guidance further down the road. So many of us seek for illumination for the days ahead, while adamantly refusing to make a move in difference to Yahuah's desires in the present moment. We wonder why we seem to be in darkness, our feet mired in the circumstances about us. The answer is simply that Yahuah gives no light for the future if we are unprepared to walk in the light he gives us for the present. 5 minutes of implicit obedience to Yahuah's will can reveal more truth to us than a month of mulling over what it is we think or suppose we should do with our own little affairs. Yahuah did not leave Gideon long in doubt as to what his next move should be. As if the first culling of his forces was not enough, there was to be an even further reduction in numbers. Surely this would be utterly calamitous. How could he possibly hope to succeed if he was to be so fearfully stripped? Yahuah's ways and men's ways are simply not the same. His thoughts and ours are very often diametrically opposite. His view and our views are so utterly divergent as to seem well nigh irreconcilable. His economy and our techniques are totally different. His methods and man's methods are miles apart. In his love and concern for us, Yahuah invites us to allow our minds to be transformed into his. He calls us to abandon our fallible human technology for his tactics. Few of us ever really do. Our little fears of failure, our petty pride of personal success, our self-centered determination to do our own thing turns us again and again to try our own techniques, to rely on our own man-made methodology to accomplish Yahuah's work in the world. We fall flat in our endeavors, then wonder what went wrong. Happily for Gideon, this was not the case. In this hour of crisis for himself, as a commander and for his people as a nation, he looked only to Yahuah for leadership. His authority came from Yahuah. His signals, conveyed by Yahuah's own merciful sovereign Ruach, were coming in clear and ungarbled. Gideon was a man under command. He was a man on the move for Yahuah. He was a man not to be deflected or diverted in any degree from the inspired decrees coming to him from above. It was a crucial hour from Yasharel. It was no time for divided opinions. It was the point at which only heavenly direction could deliver this people from their despair and ignominy as a downtrodden race. But Gideon, the remaining 10,000 troops are still far too great a force. The declaration might have seemed like sheer madness to most men. The allied forces of the Midianites, Amalekites, and Bedouin encamped across the plain numbered well over 135,000. It would have been tough enough to engage them with all his original army of 32,000. Now that he was left with only 10,000, the odds already against him were about 14 to 1. And still, Yahuah insisted he had too many. Gallant general that he was, Gideon was undaunted. He did not for a moment question Yahuah's clear directions. He took his troops down to drink as he was directed. There, Yahuah himself would select the elite corps of commandos who would carry out this daring assignment. At least, Gideon could be sure of one thing. If they were handpicked by Yahuah, they were bound to be the best. Or were they? Of the 22,000 men who earlier in the day had returned home, the majority had been the fierce fighters of Gilead, notorious for their courage in combat. Now that another large group was to be called from the ranks, the tiny handful that finally remained, at best, might seem like a contemptible remnant. Again, it was a question of Yahuah's choice of people for accomplishing his ends being quite different from ours. So often, those whom he selects to achieve great things are the last we would ever think to choose. Yahuah does not look on our outward appearance. He sees far beyond our obvious accomplishments or attainments. He seeks for those of honest spirit and open availability to do his work in the world. The principle is stated clearly by Shaul in writing to the believers at Corinth. For you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But Yahuah has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and Yahuah has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised, has Yahuah chosen, and yet things which are not, to bring to naught things that are. From Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26 through 28. And it was the same concept at work in Yahuah's own selection of 300 special men for the initial raid on the enemy camp that night. When the men followed Gideon down to drink from the water troughs beside the well of Harod, they were watched very carefully. Out of 10,000, only 300 would lap up the water like a thirsty dog running through a stream, picking up refreshment while hot on the trail of prey. It was no special honor to be so singled out. Even to be likened to a dog in any way was to be very much maligned. In Yasharelite culture, a dog was a creature of contempt. To be identified even very indirectly with a dog was to be scorned and humiliated. It was, in short, to be considered contemptible. Yet, these were the men chosen that hot afternoon by heavenly edict to perform great exploits for Yahuah. It is really remarkable that Gideon still did not debate the issue. His unshakable faith in the Eternal One stirs our deepest admiration. It could, of course, be argued that Gideon was better off to be rid of the 9,700 men who stooped down to drink deeply from the refreshing water. It has been pointed out that the troops on the verge of battle, who allowed themselves to become completely absorbed in slaking their thirst, really were not battle ready. They were not fully on guard. Their attention from the enemy had been diverted by self-indulgence in refreshment. This may all be true to a degree. Still, the point remains that the great test here was really not so much with the men themselves as it was of Gideon's faith in Yahuah. For when this sorting of his foes was finished, this rough-hewn, uncomplicated countryman had only 300 armed men still standing with him. The combat ratio had now been reduced to the ridiculous figure of 1 to 450. Put another way, for every fighting man who would go into action with him that night, the enemy was fielding 450 fierce warriors. Never, ever in the annals of warfare had the odds been so totally overwhelming. Though it is significant that in the great contest on Mount Carmel between Eliah and the false prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth, the odds were equally formidable. For there alone, Eliah challenged and overwhelmed 450 false prophets under the direct command of Yahuah. The ratio was identical. It is also of significance that out of the original forces mustered to his side, Gideon now had somewhat less than 1% of his men remaining. As Yahuah had done before, and as he always does, he was to show that one man with Yahuah is a majority. He was to prove that little, very little, can be much, so very much, when Yahuah is in it. It takes faith really to believe this. It calls for implicit confidence to act on it. Yet, this is the response Yahuah ever looks for from his people. Because always, ever, it is the honor and esteem of his character to vindicate and validate the faith of any person who invests his trust in him. He cannot do otherwise than honor both himself and those who obey him. This Gideon knew. Chapter 7. The Bit of Barley Bread. From Judges chapter 7, verse 9 through 15. Events had moved rapidly for Gideon that day. It had been a bit devastating to be stripped of almost all his military forces. No doubt, as the evening shadows lengthened across the dusty plains of Yezreel, he wondered, rather fearfully, just what this awesome night might hold. The sun, setting like a distant flaming fire over the western sea, was a red reminder that tomorrow might just be a better day. But Gideon's hope really did not rest in any natural phenomenon. His confidence, if he had any at this point, did not reside in the 300 men of valor left with him. His faith for the future lay, not in what could be seen, but in the unshakable commitment of Yahuah to him. Repeatedly, Yahuah had reassured Gideon that he would go with him against the enemy. He had assured this young farmer that it was he who would save Yasharel by his great outstretched arm. And now, once again, he was to confirm this for the youthful leader who may have felt a bit forsaken and forlorn. He was instructed to make a private sortie into the enemy camp after dark. It would be a most daring and dangerous maneuver. Perhaps Gideon's courageous heart missed a beat or two at the thought of creeping stealthily through the enemy lines. He was not at all happy with the idea of worming his way through the guards on watch. One misstep, one false move in the dark, and a Midianite spear would be plunged between his ribs. Besides, there was the horde of camels. He would have to creep past their great hulking forms in the gloom. Only one or two would have to groan uneasily or shuffle to their feet in fright, and his game would be up. No, this command called for more cold-blooded courage than open hand-to-hand combat ever did. Yahuah, who had Gideon's own best interest in mind, was fully aware of the chill, clammy fear that fastened its fist around his frightened heart. He knew that this was a terribly tough assignment, but he also knew that Gideon would not back away from it, especially if he could take his servant, Parah, along as a companion on this hazardous mission. It is ever reassuring for Yahuah's people to remind themselves that Yahuah knows us better than we know ourselves. He is completely acquainted with the strengths and weaknesses of our unpredictable characters. He never exposes us to test or put us into situations beyond our ability to handle. He deals with us in infinite integrity. And because he is Yahuah, whatever he demands of us is ultimately for the maximum benefit of both ourselves and those around us. In this particular adventure, Parah was the loyal servant selected to accompany Gideon. He had, like the 300 other fighting men, been literally singled out by Yahuah for this risky assignment. His name Parah meant fruitful, or the productive person. He was to be Gideon's right-hand man for moral support and encouragement. His greatest gift to Gideon that night was simply being there as a helpful witness to what went on. As with many of Yahuah's choicest, unsung people, this simple servant's great gift from Yahuah was just that of being a help, an encouragement when the going got very tough. His moral support was something especially precious amid the perils of the night. Together, the two men started off across the valley of Yezreel. As they stole across the wide plain toward Marah, they both recalled Yahuah's great promise to Abraham on that very spot almost exactly 1,000 years before. It was at Moreh when Abraham's gaze first fell across this fertile land that Yahuah had appeared to him and declared positively, "I will give this land unto your seed." In humble gratitude, Abraham built his first altar there and gave thanks for this assurance. Deep within their hearts, the two Yashreelites believed that Yahuah again would make good on that ancient promise to his people. Even though they could see the flickering flames of the enemy campfires and hear the low rumble of movement in the enemy lines, hope leaped in their spirits. Yahuah, their Elohim, who had been faithful to Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, Moshe, and Yahusha, and all the judges, would be true to them this dangerous night. Gideon and Parah could not be content merely to reconnoiter the enemy position in a casual sort of way. They had been sent there actually to penetrate the lines and discover what the mood of the Midianites might be. It demanded cool courage to crawl on their stomachs past the outer guards. Stealthily, they slithered through the grass, past the camels chewing their cud with great explosive grunts. Finally, despite the flickering firelight that cast shifting shadows all around them, they lay quietly behind one of the black Bedouin tents. Inside, they could hear the animated conversation of its two occupants. Apparently, one fellow had fallen asleep earlier in the evening and had a dreadful nightmare. The bad dream had been so disturbing it woke him up startled and shaken. "I dreamed this terrible thing," he yawned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and shaking his head to fully rouse himself. "Of all things, a cake of barley bread. A Hapati came tumbling into the camp." His eyes widened and his face tensed. The Hapati struck a tent and completely overturned it. In fact, despite its guide ropes and poles, it was flattened and lay in a heap on the ground. It was the impossible sort of thing from which so many dreams are fashioned. Yet, in dismay, the soldier shook his head in wonderment and fear. "I just don't understand it." His companion in the tent must have been a bit of a necromancer. Immediately, he had an explanation for the nightmare. This was not uncommon, for the desert tribes dabbled much in the signs and portents. They studied the signs of the zodiac under their desert skies, indulging much in fortune-telling and stargazing. Your dreams mean only one thing, the second man spoke with startling assurance. This overturn of a tent by a tiny bit of barley bread is nothing else than a sign of Gideon's sword. He pulled at his big black beard with nervous fingers. Gideon is the son of Joash, a man of Yasharel. Into his strong hand, Yahuah has already delivered all the host of Midian and her allies. The two men in the tent looked at each other uneasily. Panic began to show in their faces. They felt and knew instinctively that as an army, they were beaten even before the battle began. Outside in the darkness, Gideon and Parah nudged each other gleefully. Both of them grinned so widely, their strong white teeth shone pale in the shadowy night. What an incredible bit of right cheer this was! It was the sort of thing to lift a man's spirit to singing, his blood racing, and his body to bursting for battle. One man with Yahuah was a majority. Two men with Yahuah would bear back great news. 300 men with Yahuah would vanquish the enemy. Faith, hope, and optimism are based not on that which is observable. They do not depend on the data of physical or material assets. They are grounded in Yahuah. As Gideon and Parah cast their eyes around them, all they could see were thousands of camels. The black hulks of the great ungainly beast loomed up in the flickering light of the enemy campfires like 10 or 20,000 anthills surrounding them on every side. What a formidable force of cavalry mounts surrounded them on every side. Beyond that stood the endless ranks of threatening black Bedouin tents. In every one, there were fierce and ruthless men of war, warriors armed to the teeth with curved swords, long lances, and deadly daggers. It all might have been terribly terrifying, but Yahuah had given Gideon reassurance and confidence. What if the dream did liken him to a mere bit of barley bread? What did it matter if he was considered of no more consequence than a poor man's hapati? Only livestock, beggars, and lepers partook of barley flour. Any self-respecting person would feed his family on the fine flour milled from the finest wheat. But barley bread? Who but the lowest would dine on such crude, humble fare? Gideon did not mind the gib. He took no personal offense at the parallel. He was not so proud or haughty as to be hurt by this slur. It is a mark of the man that he concurred with the definition of the dream. With the definition of the dream. He saw himself as really quite insignificant in Yahuah's economy. Yet it was all in truth his willingness to be nothing that enabled him to become great in Yahuah's strong hands. A man's usefulness to Yahuah is directly proportional to his willingness to be counted of little consequence in his own ability or estimation. It is the person who holds no great or grandiose notion of his own worth whom Yahuah chooses to achieve great exploits. The very basic reason for this is simply that his own self-importance does not interfere with the ongoing plans of Yahuah. Yahuah has liberty and joyous freedom to use this individual how and where he chooses with enormous effectiveness. At this stage in Gideon's meteorite career, he was a malleable material in the master's mighty hand. He was not blinded or distracted by any self-sufficient conceit. He was not interested in protecting either his own pompousness or prestige. He was simply a sharp and powerful sword in Yahuah's great hand. Because of his implicit, unquestioning, and prompt obedience to Yahuah's command, Gideon was now a man fortified with enormous faith. There remained not a shred of doubt in his mind that absolute and ultimate victory over Midian was assured. It simply could not be otherwise. Yahuah had given him the omen. He was bound to overcome. It is worthy of note that the opportunity given to Gideon to move so swiftly from fear to faith was because of his willingness to do precisely what he had been told to do. The Ruach of the living Yahuah is given, always in generous measure, to those who comply with Yahuah's commands. He shares himself lavishly with those who cooperate with him. It is to such that he gives the faith, courage, strength, and serenity of his own presence to perform whatever is asked of them. There, in the shadow of the enemy's black goatskin tent, Gideon bowed himself humbly to the ground. In the darkness, with only Parah as a witness, he gave grateful thanks to his Yahuah for such a merciful gesture. In reverence and respect, he worshiped Yahuah, the deliverer of himself and his people. The reassuring aspect of this entire episode had been the knowledge that Yahuah had been very active and at work behind the scenes. Behind the enemy lines, in some remarkable manner, word had swept along the human grapevine that Yahuah had singled out Gideon for great exploits. Although previously he may have been an obscure farmer on his marginal land, now suddenly he was assuming the role of a notorious and mighty man of war in Yasharel. The stories of Gideon's face-to-face encounter with Yahuah had swept across the countryside. Men and women had heard about the celestial fire flaming from the rock to consume his sacrifice of meat, bread, and gravy. Tales had been told how Gideon had torn down the venerated altar of Baal and statue to Ashtaroth. The tribes had heard how men in multitudes were willing to take up arms to follow this young revolutionary. Even the incredible account of the fleece had run along the far-flung lines of word-of-mouth messengers. Suddenly, Gideon had become a household name throughout the camps, without the benefit of mass media. All of it was part and parcel of the power and influence of Yahuah's Ruach at work behind the scenes. Unknown to Gideon, the news had even swept across the Jordan into the enemy encampments of the desert waste. In the scattered villages and nomadic tent camps, Gideon's prowess had become a thrilling saga fraught with fearsome consequences for his foes. Partly, this was why the Midianites had swept back into Palestine with their Amalekite and Bedouin allies at the time. They hoped to suppress and crush any popular uprising that might erupt in Yasharel. They were sure that they could again grind Yasharel into the ground. But Yahuah had other designs. He had heard the pleas of his people. He had found a great man in Gideon. So now the tables would be turned, and all the world would wonder at his work. For all of us who are Yahuah's children, it is tremendously helpful to realize that Yahuah, by his Ruach, never slumbers nor sleeps. He is not indolent or idle. He does not neglect those who trust in him. He is, instead, tremendously active and at work on their behalf. Often, we are totally unaware of where or how our Yahuah may be arranging matters on our behalf. But he does. Frequently, the net result astonishes us beyond our fondest hopes or wildest dreams. That night, Gideon and Parah slipped away safely through the enemy lines. They sped back swiftly across the plains to the Yasharelite camp at Morah. In breathless excitement and with blazing eyes, Gideon shouted to his sleepy stalwarts, "Arise! Yahuah has delivered the host of Midian into your hand." It was a ringing note of triumph. It galvanized his 300 warriors into terrible tigers, eager now to pounce on their prey. Chapter 8, Attack at Midnight. From Judges, chapter 7, verses 16 through 22. Gideon's reasonable battle cry, "Yahuah has delivered the host of Midian into your hand," was picked up by his men. It became their war cry, their battle song. This was to be a conquest in which they all shared. It was no one-man show. It was Yahuah who was their commander-in-chief. It was he who would see them all become jubilant victors. The events of the next few hours of this dramatic night moved with dazzling speed. Gideon was now an inspired general. Using his native wit and keen intellect, under the guidance of Yahuah's own Ruach, who indwelt in him so abundantly, he acted with enormous commanding authority. Quickly, he ordered his 300 picked men into 3 companies of 100 each. Gathering up earthenware containers from among the whole host they had gathered at Harod, he issued an empty clay pitcher to each combatant. The men had brought provisions in these vessels, now being turned over to another use. Similarly, he ordered each man to be equipped with a torch that was carried inside the clay container. These were to be borne in their left hands. In each man's right hand, there was placed a crude trumpet. Most of these were made from curling ram's horns. They were not the gleaming gold or silver instruments found in temple processions. Rather, they were the rough, hand-carved battle bugles carried by common people into combat. The Midianites had long ago stripped Yasharel of her silver and gold. It had long since been melted down and beaten into beautiful earrings and gorgeous camel chains that were the pride of the desert raiders. These fine and glittering ornaments dangled from the ears of the wild warriors. They tinkled around the necks of their camels, sparkling in the sun and showing off their wealth. Besides the earthenware pitchers, the smoldering torches concealed inside, and the mountain horns in their right hands, each of Gideon's 300 stalwarts bore a sharp sword strapped to his side by a broad belt. There would be blood, sweat, and appalling carnage before this action was over. Gideon was the leader of impressive might this night. Without fanfare or apology, he spoke directly and firmly to his followers. "Look to me for your orders. Whatever I do, you do. When we surround the enemy encampment, coming at it from 3 different sides, synchronize your actions with those of my company. We will all blow on our trumpets at once. Then shout at the top of your lungs, 'The sword of Yahuah and Gideon.'" Gideon knew the primitive superstitions of the desert tribes well enough to realize this sort of surprise attack would utterly demoralize them. Those who dabbled in the occult and regulated their lives by signs and portents could easily be panicked in the dark. His sortie with Porah had already disclosed to him that a mood of fear and foreboding was doing its deadly work among the foe. Without further delay, Gideon led his little band down into the valley of Yezreel. Stealthily and swiftly as the darkness would permit, they crossed the broad plain. In sinister silence, they encircled the Midianite camp. The 300 men formed a very thin, sparse line around the huge conglomerate of black tents, camels, and battle gear. It was exactly midnight. A new watch of guards had just come on duty. The sleepy-eyed sentinels who had let Gideon and Porah slip through their guard now turned into their tents. But their slumber was to be short-lived. In a few moments, the still night air was shattered and split by the resounding blast of 301 wild war horns. In blind, bewildered panic, the desert fighters bolted wide awake. They burst out of their black tents to hear the terrible trumpet blast barking at them from every side. In heart-chilling consternation, they were sure a fierce feud had erupted amid their own ranks. The desert tribesmen never did trust one another. Treachery and intertribal warfare were their way of life. With the flash of a sword, swift as the wink of an eye, one warrior turned upon another to draw blood. It is ever thus where hot passions rule. In the confusion, there arose a sound even more terrifying than the bugle cries. It was the unleashed battle call of Gideon and his men. Lungs bursting, throat muscles swelling, blood surging through their veins, they shouted fiercely, madly, ferociously, "The sword of Yahuah and Gideon!" The rising, quivering, terrorized cry was torn from the throats of 300 unleashed tigers. Their hour of utter triumph had come. The terrified enemy troops, in crazed fear, rushed upon each other. Midianite slayed Midianite, Amalekite or Bedouin in the darkness. Comrade cut down comrade with no thought of whom he wounded. Shrieks of pain, groans of agony, and shouts of fear engulfed the whole camp in chaos. The grumbling camels lurched to their feet and rushed off riderless. They trod men under their hard, horny hooves, trampled on the fallen, sometimes collided into tents. Suddenly, an even more astonishing sound shattered the night. It was the crash and clatter of 300 clay pitchers smashing against one another. Gideon's warriors smashed jar against jar with fragments falling at their feet. It was a strange, unusual clanking sound, like a host of manacled ghosts surging around the camp. The Bedouin were utterly petrified with fear, but the worst was yet to come. Fed by the fresh night air, the smoldering torches burst into flame. The flickering, dancing light looked like the flames of hell let loose. It was more than the Midianites could possibly handle. Never had these desert hawks been so terrorized. In the flickering, weird, awful light of the flaming flares, they rushed at each other in unbridled disarray. A mad mania of fear drove them to desperate ends. The spirit of Yahuah swept through their ranks, producing passionate terror in 100,000 hearts. Men rushed hither and thither, yelling, screaming, swinging their swords wildly, felling their friends in a gory bloodbath. It was utter mayhem. Around the perimeter of the camp, Gideon's men stood strong. Each man was in position. They did not panic or withdraw. Exultingly, they blew their trumpets, waved their torches high, and between bugle blast shouted aloud. Only the great crash of Jericho's walls beneath the bugle blasts of Yasharel could ever compare with the cataclysmic conquest of this terrible night. Yasharel had neither heard nor seen such a spectacle for roughly 200 years. In those few short hours after midnight, the whole of history had been turned around. The oppressor had become the oppressed. The raider had become the savaged. The spoiler had been spoiled. It was a tremendous triumph for the valiant 300, but it had been an ever greater victory for Yahuah of Yasharel and his giant, Gideon. In total disarray, the fragmented enemy forces fled off into the dark. Most of the Midianites, their camels having stampeded away, fled on foot. They were heading back home, making for the river fords along the Jordan. In stark panic, they retreated eastwards towards Bethsheada, the house of the scourge with acacia thorns, Zerath, the place of oppression, Abu Meholah, mourning instead of dancing, and Tabbath, the place that was good but is no longer. For Midian, it was a total rout. For Gideon, It was total victory. The conquest of that night has come down to us across the centuries as an outstanding historical event. Yet, it is much, much more than just that. It is more than a great tactical victory against overwhelming odds. It is more than a demonstration of superb leadership and unusual intelligence. There was at work in this engagement inspired, Yah-given spiritual principles which we can apply to our lives with enormous benefit. To begin with, see that once Gideon was assured of victory, he wasted no time at all moving into action against Midian. It is remarkable that in the span of a single day and night, he had sorted out all the forces under his command. He had personally risked great danger to reconnoiter the enemy camp. He had settled on the exact tactics to overthrow the enemy. In short, he did not sit around discussing or debating what he should do. He just did it. There's a tremendous truth here. In our engagements for Yahuah, there is sometimes far too much talk. It is common for Yahuah's people often to get caught up in tiresome deliberations, wearisome meetings, endless committees, and the fatigue of going round and round the bush. Gideon was essentially a man of action. He heard the voice of Yahuah. He knew what was expected of him. He did it, and the results were dramatic. It is also of great significance that he did not resort to extra special techniques or tools to accomplish his assignment. Such commonplace things as earthenware containers, homemade torches, and ram's horns taken from the hill flocks could be collected from family farms and homesteads. He used what was right at hand. He did not go off in search of sophisticated paraphernalia to accomplish his purposes. It was the common shepherd's rod in Moshe's hand that broke Egypt's power over Yasharel. It was the sling and a small smooth stone in Daoud's hand that slew Goliath and routed the Philistines. It was the small sardines and little buns in a boy's hands that fed the famished thousands. What Yahuah asks of us is not some super special or unusual equipment to achieve his ends. He simply asks, "What have you got in your hand? Put it at my disposal. Let me use it through you to Baruch 1,000 lives." Too often, we tend to forget, overlook, or deliberately ignore the everyday commonplace things available to us for Yahuah's service. In our search for something special or unusual, we lose sight of the fact that our living Elohim can take any cup, pen, or tool held in a ready hand and use it to do great things if we will let him. Our Messiah is not in any way confined or constricted except by our human reluctance to let him have his wondrous way in our cramped little lives. Another rather remarkable principle we see in this episode is the part played by both the leader and by his followers. Once Gideon was in command, he recognized that there rested on him the responsibility for the conduct of his entire corps. It was not a question of, "Don't do as I do, just do as I say," which is all too common among Yahuah's people. Rather, it was a positive directive that his followers should all do exactly as I do. Gideon was no armchair tactician. He did not command from a remote headquarters. He identified himself intimately with his men. He was a frontline general. He was in the forefront of the action. He put his own reputation on the line. He risked his very own life. Our Messiah, Yahushua, when he was among us, did precisely the same. He said to his followers, "As the Father has sent me into the world, so I send you." Elsewhere, he said, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the earth." if any man or woman assumes leadership among Yahuah's people, to be truly effective, he cannot hold himself aloof from the common crowd in their struggles with sin, Hasatan, and their own selves. Preachers and teachers must not take refuge in their ivory towers of prestige and privilege, but rather they must get down into the trenches with their troops and tramp the tough trails in their war-torn sandals. As for Gideon's men, their behavior in this battle stirs our spirits to the depths. To quote Tennyson, "Ours is not to question why, ours is but to do or die." It had not been the special privilege of these 300 men to see and know Yahuah as Gideon had done. He alone had seen fire come from a rock to consume his sacrifice. He alone had heard the voice of Yahuah command him to tear down the altar to Baal and cut down the idol of Ashtaroth. He alone had seen the fleece first drenched with dew, then later left bone dry. He alone, except for Parah, had heard the dream of the barley bread explained. To all of the other 300, these revelations had to be accepted and believed on naked faith. It stands as a remarkable monument to their fortitude that without question or hesitation, they went to war in this calm, strong faith. Much more than that, they stood their ground, each man precisely in his place, exactly as commanded. Each had his part to play, and he played it to the hilt. The total result was a stirring triumph. Not all of us are chosen of Yahuah for leadership roles. Not all of us are to be Gideons, but among us, the laity, it is expected that we will each do our part and be in our place. The whole battle cannot be carried by our leaders. The preacher, teacher, and anyone in command needs the wholehearted cooperation of the common people. Our responsibility, too, is to blow the bugle, proclaim the Besorah, hold high the torch, live the life of light in a dark world, and shout aloud for the honor of our Yahuah. When we do, Yahuah will grant victory.